Mystics of the past had a long-standing tradition of looking backwards at languages. Ancient, dead languages are ideal for sacred purposes, as they never change. But perhaps more importantly, their age and antiquity lend them an equal degree of sanctity, as the thought is that all languages in the world must trace their roots back to some primordial archetype. Theoretically, if you went far enough back, you would eventually come across the very first language in its most untouched form. Pure, just as God or the gods delivered it. This language, for the purposes of our investigation, will be referred to either as celestial speech, angelical, or Enochian. They are all different terms for the same concept: the language of God and angels. The lore of Enochian largely derives from the Book of Genesis, the Book of Revelation, and the apocryphal Book of Enoch. However, many key details between them were delivered during the alleged prophetic visions of two particular Englishmen in the 16th century, but we'll get to them in a bit. In the beginning, God spoke the universe into existence using a series of divine words, the letters of which burned onto 49 celestial tablets. But contained within these tablets was not only the language of creation, but all knowledge, past, present, and future, and the very keys to unlock and enter the gates of heaven. These same tablets appear in different forms in different religions throughout time. The Egyptians called it the Book of Thoth. Hebrew legends speak of the Sefer Raziel. But in Enochian, the language of heaven and angels, they are known as the Logaeth, or speech from God. In the Garden of Eden, Adam spoke the language found within Logaeth, holding familiar conversations with the Creator and giving every plant, creature, and object its true name. But his fluency was stricken when he and Eve were expelled from paradise. No longer could Adam speak with God or with the angels. In order to communicate with his family, Adam created the first human language based on his fractured and flawed memories of the celestial speech. This would have been an ancient form of Hebrew that would be wholly unrecognizable today. It was 7 generations later that the prophet Enoch, from which Enochian gets its name, was deemed worthy enough by the archangels to not only re-establish communication, but to visit heaven to view the angelic choirs, the throne of God, and the celestial tablets themselves. During his visit, he copied 366 books, a mere fraction of the celestial tablets, and he was instructed by the angels to reseed this wisdom back into humanity. Alas, Enoch would ultimately fail, as his work was lost in the great flood that destroyed the world. Adam's primordial Hebrew tongue persisted up until the incident at the Tower of Babel. There, the rulers of Babylon ordered the construction of a colossal tower that was to reach heaven itself. Sickened by this hubris, God confused the tongues of the builders, severing all mode of communication between them and ending the project for good. Eventually, the builders moved away from Babylon and founded their own nations, establishing the various language families of the world. Adam's original Hebrew was lost, and the final fragments of the first language died with it. Millenniums pass. Our final stop is Renaissance England. The year is 1582, and a pair of new prophets begin to receive messages from beings claiming to be angels. The two Englishmen, a world-famous mathematician and an alchemist with a dark past, are told that they were selected to reseed the lost angelic language into humanity. and they are given this knowledge through a series of complex cryptographic puzzles. I'm Mr. Mythos, and I welcome you to Truth or Lore. Be sure to subscribe if you love the mysteries of history like I do. Every sub is a massive support to the videos I make on my channel. You're about to explore not only the fascinating Enochian language itself, but also the truly mind-bending escapades of the two men involved. Without further ado, we'll begin by meeting our main protagonist, Dr. John Dee. This is Dee, a man described as tall and slender, with a very fair, clear sanguine complexion, a long beard as white as milk. He wore a gown like that of an artist, with hanging sleeves. But more than handsome and well-dressed, Dr. John Dee was undoubtedly one of the most influential forces in England. He was a world-renowned mathematician, linguist, navigator, inventor, astronomer, and astrologer, and through this capacity, he was the right-hand advisor to Queen Elizabeth I. Very little could occur without his expert consult, or a trip to his home in the town of Mortlake, which was considered at the time to be the largest and richest library in England, with more than 4,000 ancient scientific tomes, many of which he had sought and collected by hand. Dee lived during the English Renaissance, a time when science, magic, and religion blended like paints on a palette, and were largely considered interconnected parts in a grand search for understanding. Dee was an intense Christian, and many times stated that all knowledge served God. His religious beliefs were strongly influenced by Hermetic philosophies. Thus, he believed that the divine could influence nature, and natural scientific application could influence the divine. We find astrology and alchemy to be prime examples of this. But a third branch, known as theurgy, began to obsess Dee's mind. As the scientific world became more and more known to him, he sought knowledge that could not be extracted from the natural world. Theurgy, which translates to operation of the gods, was the study and practice of invoking supernatural deities, such as angels, to acquire lost knowledge or disclose ancient mysteries. Though his independent theurgical practice seemed to hit walls at every turn, one autumn evening of 1581, John Dee knelt in prayer, and, according to his journal, there suddenly glowed a dazzling light, in the midst of which, in all his glory, stood the great angel, Uriel. This entity handed Dee a bright, clear crystal the size of an egg, and told him that by gazing through it, he could establish contact with angels. If you've ever seen an image of an old wizard gazing into a crystal ball, this cliché finds its roots in the story of John Dee. This technique would become known as scrying, where messages are transmitted from alternate realities by gazing into a suitable reflective surface. Dee called his crystal a shoe stone, and for weeks he tried to use it following Uriel's exact instructions, with no luck. Frustrated, he eventually hired other scryers, and they either failed the same as him, or were caught by Dee's careful eye as frauds. That was, until a year later, that a man approached John Dee and introduced himself as Edward Talbot, although his real name, or at least what we believe to be his real name, was Edward Kelley. To modern historians, many details of his true identity and perhaps dark and troubled past remain uncertain. Edward Kelley wore a cap on his head to hide the fact that both of his ears were cropped, a common punishment for forgery. He claimed to descend from the family of Enochian of Ireland, and that he worked as a notary in London. Though his name was not in the registry of any known university, it is certain that Kelley was well educated, particularly in alchemy, and he knew both Latin and Greek. In their very first meeting, Kelley did what no other before him could do. He saw, heard, and spoke to the angels as an almost innate talent, and John Dee was convinced that Kelley's skill was genuine. To this day, there are reasons to side with Dee's assessment, despite the questionable character of Kelley, and this we'll explore in depth later. As for now, it was this fateful meeting that marked the beginning of an intense and eventful partnership that would last for 7 years, in which Dee and Kelley would perform scrying sessions almost daily. Under John Dee's command, these were conducted with the utmost Christian piety, forcing long periods of prayer, purification, and fasting prior. Then Kelley would gaze into sacred objects, such as Dee's mystical shoe stone and a black obsidian mirror, and report his visions. And in his precious journals, Dee would carefully document everything that Kelley saw or heard. In that first angelic conference, Kelley made contact with one of the 7 planetary archangels, Enel, who claimed to be the current successive ruler of the cosmos. In the following sessions, Enel then introduced the 2 Englishmen to the 4 archangels known as Uriel, Raphael, Michael, and Gabriel. It was these angels and the lesser angels directed by them that would eventually deliver the language we call Enochian. John Dee was a learned scholar and knew well the legends of Enoch, the last purported human to speak with angels. In fact, he had long thought about the prophet, even before his vision of Uriel. Enoch was an alluring and highly mysterious figure for many scholars during Dee's time, and there are good reasons for this. To begin, he is only mentioned once in the entire Old Testament, and just as an entry in a long list of forefathers within the book of Genesis. There we learn that Enoch was the father of Methuselah, the longest-lived human in the Bible at 969 years, and the great-grandfather of Noah, who built the ark to survive the Great Deluge. But these relations are not why Enoch is so fascinating. 7 is a sacred number in the Bible, and Enoch is the 7th generation from Adam. Next, Enoch is said to have lived 365 years, another sacred number, as the number of days in a solar year. Lastly, he is the only forefather in the entire list without a record of death. His passage reads as follows: Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. And that is the last mention of Enoch in the Old Testament. That is, unless you count the apocryphal Book of Enoch, which, after 500 years of being biblical canon, was stricken from the official Bible by both Jewish and Catholic authorities as blasphemy around the year 200 AD. This ancient and unique text contains the story of fallen angels, the origins of giants known as Nephilim, and the moral reasoning behind the Great Flood in Genesis. But perhaps most importantly, it fleshes out the details of the prophet Enoch and serves as the oldest known record of his life. By the medieval era, no living person in the Western world had ever read it. The legend of Enoch persisted only by word of mouth. So long had scholars and mystics continued to search for a surviving copy. But this would be found in Ethiopia in the 18th century, 200 years after John Dee died. So now you understand why it made sense that in 1583, one of Dee's first serious requests to the angels was for a copy of the Book of Enoch, as one of the known powers of angels was finding and obtaining long-lost texts. To his surprise, the archangels agreed, and they indeed upheld their promise to Dee. They brought him a Book of Enoch. However, it wasn't the apocryphal lost chapter of the Bible that Dee had in mind. They brought him a far more valuable treasure: the celestial tablets that Enoch himself had read and copied from during his legendary visit to heaven. The angels called it Logaeth. In their language, this translated to speech from God. They told the two men that it contained the 49 speeches God used to create the world, entrances to the 48 gates of heaven, and the recorded destinies of all things in the universe in all dimensions of time. To Edward Kelley, the book appeared as a tome of 49 leaves, and each leaf contained two 49 by 49 square grids, one on the front and one on the back. An alien script filled the squares, the letters of which had been delivered in the form of a 21-character talismanic alphabet just days earlier. Here, they were written in what Kelley assumed to be the blood of lambs, as referenced in the Book of Revelation. Upon the receival of Logaeth, Dee understood the tables to be a series of cryptographic puzzles, as the angels did not immediately provide a way to translate or decipher the grids. They only stated that the purpose of the Book of Logaeth was to open the gates of heaven, either to summon angels to earth or to enter the celestial realm directly, as Enoch once did. The angels explained that John Dee was expected to continue where Enoch had failed. Dee was to become a new prophet of God and reseed the lost language of angels back into the world of man. As he conducted his seances, Dr. John Dee simultaneously instructed the science of navigation to many of those who would conduct England's voyages of discovery, and he found himself struck with a similar inspiration and opportunity. With the Queen's blessing, the doctor abruptly left his position at her side to travel to continental Europe, with Edward Kelley and their families trailing behind. They would spend the next 6 years as nomads as they keenly continued their angelic seances from city to city and attempted to win the patronage of kings, emperors, and clergymen. Copious notes in John Dee's journals reveal that Dee was more enthusiastic than ever, and Kelley was initially just as committed to their mutual goal when they arrived on the continent. But over time, it became apparent that Kelley was more interested in alchemy than scrying, and they scryed nearly every day. As the months and years passed, Kelley expressed deepening frustrations and a desire to stop. But Dee insisted that they continue their work. The second set of Enochian texts were received by Kelley in 1584 in the city of Krakow, where they stayed in the court of Polish King Stefan Batory. These would be known as the 48 keys, and there is a distinct difference between the language written in them versus the language used in the Book of Logaeth. Whether they are two dialects of the same celestial speech, as Dee postulated, the 48 keys can be considered as the Enochian language proper, as this time around they were given translations, thus providing a foundation of Enochian grammar and vocabulary. As for the contents, the 48 keys are an example of pure esoteric literature. On the surface, they seem to be a series of archaic and convoluted poetic verses. But in order for one to decipher the actual meanings behind them, that person would need to possess deep knowledge of astrology, ancient Hebrew mysticism, and numerology. Even John Dee, who is a world-recognized expert in these fields, would never fully deduce their meanings. And this was a problem, as the angels revealed that the true purpose of the 48 keys was to present a solution to the 49 cryptographic puzzles in the Book of Logaeth, finally allowing Dee and Kelley to access the literal words of God, and their destiny as successors of Enoch. This lock and key system between the two texts was referred to as Gebofal by the archangels, and involved a 49-day ritual over which each key would invoke the angel guarding one of the 49 gates of heaven, these gates represented by the magic tables in Logaeth. Moving on, we now approach one of the most perplexing pieces of evidence for Enochian authenticity. If the delivery of the Book of Logaeth seemed like a simple case of glossolalia, or speaking in tongues, particularly as there were never any translations given, the picture becomes a bit more complicated when considering exactly how the 48 keys were received in Krakow. Each key was processed letter by letter, word by word, backwards. The exact process is understood by piecing together Dee's highly detailed notes and transcripts. For example, Edward Kelley, in his trance, would report that the angel points to column 5, rank 23. John Dee would then reference the relevant grid in the Book of Logaeth and write down the letter he found in that square. Once the cipher sequence was complete, Dee was instructed to rewrite each word backwards to reveal the true message. So what does this mean? Well, if we were to take the stance that Kelley was a con man, we would have to consider an incredible feat. To produce the keys, he would have had to memorize the grids within the Book of Logaeth. There are 96 grids in total, each 49 by 49 squares. This requires knowing the identity and exact position of 117,649 talismanic letters. Not to mention that he would have had to create his own functional language, write poetry in it, and painstakingly spell those poetic verses backwards to John Dee. Why would Kelley go through all this trouble? If he was attempting to deceive Dee, wouldn't there have been an easier way? Clearly, meticulous care was taken in the delivery of the keys. There were no misspellings, nor were there noticeable errors in word usage between parts. After the ciphers were written, English translations were tapped out on little strips of paper, emerging from the angel's gaping mouth. This is how the Enochian we know today was received.
The mighty sounds have entered in the third angle and are become as olives in the olive mount, looking with gladness upon the earth and dwelling in the brightness of the heavens as continual comforters.
Now would be a good time to cross-examine Enochian itself and ask whether it's a real, functional language. To begin, Enochian has been studied by many linguists throughout the years to determine its characteristics and authenticity as a natural language, as opposed to an invented one. Here's what they learned. Enochian possesses its own unique phonetic system, grammar, and syntax, with a vocabulary that may be rather limited due to the non-availability of other texts, but is still able to produce subtle, complex, and intricate parlance, as seen in the translation of the 48 keys. This has led skeptics to believe that the Enochian language may actually be plagiarized from another linguistic source. But Enochian shows no relation to any known language, including Biblical Hebrew, which is often thought by Christians and Jews to be the closest relative to the original primordial language of Adam. The linguistic problem created by this is that historians of languages generally agree that it's impossible for a person to invent a new language without drawing from existing sources, whether intentionally or not. If Enochian truly is unique in this regard, one must seriously consider the possibility that this language delivered to Edward Kelley is natural, or technically supernatural. Even the most respected and challenging critic of Enochian, the linguist Donald Laycock, writes the following at the conclusion of the Complete Enochian Dictionary, which he authored. We still do not know whether it is a natural or an invented language. If the language itself is difficult to challenge, we must now turn to its script system. The Enochian alphabet has 21 letters. When spelled, diacritical marks, also known as accents, may be included, and only a scant few letters have direct English equivalents, while many have their own unique pronunciation. Enochian script is written from right to left, which is its only similarity to ancient Biblical Hebrew. If Kelley or Dee drew inspiration from another source, it's possible that we'd find it in the alphabet, which was the first angelic material received by Kelley just days before the Book of Logaeth in March of 1583. It's notable that John Dee once owned an alchemical treatise written by Giovanni Pantheus in 1530, which contained a table labeled Enochian Alphabet of the Ancients. In the treatise itself, one can find an abundance of notes scribbled by John Dee, and even an attempt to write his own name using Pantheus's alphabet. But if you look closely, there is virtually no similarity to the angelic script received by Edward Kelley. If anything, this just shows that Dee's pursuit of the Enochian language dates back further into his academic career than what was once thought. Though John Dee and Edward Kelley continued to work cooperatively, the tension between the two Englishmen grew starkly as they traveled the continent, particularly after the reception of the 48 keys. During this time, a close associate remarked that Dee seems to have driven Kelley to the brink of insanity, forcing him to perform long scrying sessions on a near daily basis. To add to this, Dee demanded long periods of fasting and cleansing before each. Perhaps this unending stress upon Edward Kelley is what brought about the infamous cross-matching incident that would ultimately lead to the destruction of their partnership. In 1587, Kelley made contact with the angels once more, but this time they brought with them an unexpected demand. In the interest of furthering the philosophical partnership of the two men, they ordered that John Dee and Edward Kelley share everything they had. Everything. and this included their wives. Dee was hurt and anguished by this order, as was his wife, Jane, who reportedly fell weeping and trembling. Of course, he initially objected, but after days of interrogation of Kelley and the angels themselves, should they be demons in disguise, he became convinced at the end that the order was genuine and that it was God's will. John Dee wrote in his diary, May 22nd, Mistress Kelley received the sacrament, and to me and my wife gave her hand in charity, and we rushed not from her. The pain and regret proved too much for Dee, and he could no longer proceed with their angelical meetings. 9 months later, Jane Dee gave birth to a son, Theodorus Trebonianus Dee. There was speculation among them that the boy was actually Kelley's, but Theodore was raised as Dee's own, and Dee loved him indifferently. The cross-matching incident would remain a secret for the remainder of John Dee's life. In 1589, he and his family returned to England, and Edward Kelley found work as the chief alchemist of Rudolph II. They would never see each other again. It's finally time to dive into the theories surrounding the authenticity of Enochian. We'll begin with the prime culprit, a man who has carried the label of fraud and charlatan for centuries, Edward Kelley. So who was he really? It's true that he was known to Dee under a different name, Edward Talbot, and we can only assume that Kelley was his real name. Historians know that he was well educated, but have difficulty tracking down exactly where. The most likely institution is Oxford University, where the name Talbot of Ireland was found as a Bachelor of Divinity. According to students who housed with his Talbot, at some point he abruptly left Oxford with an unsettled mind. The reason for his leaving remains unknown. And from face value, Edward Kelley certainly fits the profile of an untrustworthy figure. Alleged crimes he was tried for in his past include forgery, counterfeiting, and necromancy, the practice of using dead bodies to foretell prophecies. Thus, many skeptics of Enochian's authenticity believe that Kelley deceived John Dee for the purpose of gaining money and influence, which is a legitimate motive. Dee never actually saw or heard the angels he communicated with. All messages were transmitted to and from through Kelley. Dee candidly confesses in his diary, "You know I cannot see nor scry." And this emphasizes the trust he placed in Kelley's word. This clearly leaves Kelley in an advantageous position, but there are indeed a multitude of problems with this theory. First, it seemed to John Dee and all other witnesses that Kelley was a rather reluctant participant in the long term of Dee's angelic pursuit. For someone who apparently wanted to break off the seances during the receival of the 48 keys, the arduous, stressful, and needlessly complex method of their delivery would appear to be even more undesirable. Again, we would have to assume that he not only memorized the positions of 117,649 characters, but that he could speak Enochian backwards. When many times Kelley complained to Dee that he could barely understand the learned tongues forward, why would he go through such lengths and trouble? Second, the English translation of the 48 keys display a completely different writing style as compared to Kelley's own works. The solution would be that Kelley plagiarized them, but yet again, no source material has ever been found. Third, it is often overlooked that Kelley was only one in a line of several scryers approved and employed by John Dee. Before him was Barnabas Saul. Then after Kelley was John Dee's own son, Arthur, who was finally succeeded by Bartholomew Hickman. If Edward Kelley had falsified the angelic conversations, stylistic, thematic, and methodological fluctuations between each scryer would be found in the transcripts recorded by Dee, and this is not the case. The reality is that Dee's conversations with the archangels Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, and Uriel seem to change little from one scryer to the next, and with many direct parallels found between them. From this, we may actually begin to draw suspicions from another individual, the only one present through the entire length of this enterprise, Dr. John Dee himself. If there was any man capable of creating Enochian, perhaps it would have been John Dee. This man was incredibly learned, particularly in mathematics and, more relevantly, cryptography. Because of his expertise, John Dee was actually the founder of England's very first secret intelligence service, a predecessor to the UK's modern-day MI6. He established the world's most elaborate network of spies at that time under the rule of Elizabeth I. And when he wrote to his queen, he signed his name as 007, a trait that inspired that of the fictional spy James Bond. And this leads to a rather interesting theory that John Dee was actually England's first spy, as he traveled across continental Europe with Kelley under the disguise of an eccentric old man searching for angels. Indeed, John Dee was loyally devoted to his beloved England. Who do you think coined the term British Empire? He was not only one of Queen Elizabeth's primary advisors, he was also her longtime personal friend. They first met when the young princess, Elizabeth Tudor, was held under house arrest by her paranoid half-sister, the ruling queen who would become known to history as Bloody Mary. Dee was Elizabeth's science tutor, and they developed a friendship which would eventually last a lifetime. As queen, Elizabeth funded many of his mystical endeavors and protected her friend against those who accused him of witchcraft. And Dee would always remain by her side, continuing close communication with her, even as he left England with Kelley. Maybe this fact grants Dee some deserved credibility and trustworthiness. On this note, we may also need to consider that Dee was an intensely devout Christian, and it was obvious to everyone around him that he took his research into the magic and language of angels seriously, sometimes in vulnerable moments expressing great frustration over the torturous task of translation and understanding its convoluted pronunciation and grammar. His character is consistent and not easily doubted. Since the very kindling of his interest in divine wisdom, Dee sought it out not only for his own curiosity as an insatiable scholar, but as a sacred duty to heaven. He states in his journal, "My commission is from God. I feign nothing, neither am I a hypocrite, an ambitious man, or doting or dreaming in this cause." Thus, the last question asked by skeptics is often of Dee's sanity. During his lifetime, there were never any signs of mental illness reported by his family or associates, one of whom commented that Dee's approach to every seance was singularly free from deluded fanaticism. In his own notes, one can find his painstaking cross-examination of each transcript, his meticulous authentication of each angel's identity, and his most vulnerable self-reflections and admissions of failure. Thus, the brain sickness theory is a disservice to a man that certainly deserves history's respect. Free from the shackles of angels and John Dee, Edward Kelley went on to indulge in the patronage of Holy Roman Emperor Rudolph II, whom he had convinced that his alchemical experiments would soon produce gold. He lived lavishly, and in 1590 was even knighted Sir Edward Kelley of Imani and Nuluban. This high lifestyle, however, would not last long, as the destiny of Kelley would begin to play its cards. In May of 1591, Rudolph arrested and imprisoned Kelley, supposedly for killing an official named Jiri Hunkler in a duel. It's more likely, however, that Rudolph didn't want Kelley to escape from Prague before he actually produced gold. 4 years later, in the dungeons, Kelley pleaded with Rudolph, finally convincing him that he could fulfill his alchemic promise. He was restored to his former status, but under close watch over many months, he was unable to transmute the materials into gold. Tired of Kelley's sly games, Rudolph imprisoned him for the final time in Geneveen Castle in the city of Most. In 1598, Kelley attempted to escape from the high tower. He fell, broke his legs, and was dragged back into the dungeon, dying from his injuries only a few days later. If fate seemed cruel to Kelley, John Dee's was more quiet and solemn. At the request of Queen Elizabeth herself, Dee returned with his family to England in 1589. He arrived in London by train, the guard of 20 soldiers at his side. The Queen received him in Richmond and welcomed him back. Unfortunately, reality set in when he finally returned to his home in Mortlake, finding that his precious, beloved personal library had been vandalized without mercy, its interior torched, and more than a third of its priceless manuscripts stolen. He learned that many of his neighbors feared him to be a conjurer. Much had changed in England since he left. Now his study and practice of the occult was damningly scrutinized and no longer accepted by the public. John Dee's heart in shambles, he sought support from Elizabeth, who graciously appointed him a new position as warden of Christ Church in Manchester. But even there, he was despised and cheated by his fellows and subordinates. And soon after, his wife Jane and 2 of their daughters were taken by the Black Death epidemic. In 1603, Queen Elizabeth died and was immediately succeeded by James I. King James ordered the surveillance of all known sorcerers, of which they greatly harassed the 76-year-old John Dee, stripping him of his work positions. Finally, as a beaten old man, he sold whatever beloved books remained, one by one, in order to feed himself and his daughter Catherine, who cared for him until his death at the age of 81 in Mortlake. Dee's gravestone was stolen, and thus his burial site and exact year of death remain unknown to this day. Reflecting upon the fate of John Dee, I'll note that he recorded a bone-chilling nightmare in 1583, the year he left England with Kelley. Saturday night, I dreamed that I was dead, and afterward my bowels were taken out. I walked and talked with divers, and among others, with the Lord Thresorer, who was come to my house to burn my books. Though the tale of Dr. John Dee and his search for divine knowledge is tragic. Today, the complexities of Dee are recognized, as are his political and scientific contributions to the world at large. But his most important work, at least considered by him, was the celestial language he and Kelley discovered. And what we know about Enochian today comes directly from his meticulous journalings. As an old man, fearful that his neighbors and townsfolk would burn his work as heretical, he hid several of his journals and a grimoire in the false bottom of a wooden chest, where they would remain hidden for over 50 years after his death. This chest was auctioned off to a confectioner as a gift to his wife, who didn't discover the false bottom until 20 years later. Leaving the found journals at her desk for later investigation, her illiterate maid tore many of the pages to kindle the fireplace, until the wife caught her doing this and rescued what scraps remained. What we still have today is significant, largely thanks to the level of detail and copious amount of notes produced by John Dee. Unfortunately, that doesn't make up for the fact that parts of Dee's original manuscripts are now lost, as is the ability to fully interpret the meaning and validity of Enochian. Speaking of Enochian, Dee never actually called it that. He referred to it variously as Adamical, angelical, or celestial speech. Today, we call it Enochian due to the Book of Logaeth allegedly descending from the mythological work copied by Enoch, in the same way that the books of the Torah are referred to as Mosaic, in reference to the biblical hero Moses. Much of Dee's Enochian knowledge remained hidden in unopened journals that were auctioned off to different households, until the late 1800s, when a group known as the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn was formed. They made a serious effort to collect and include Dee's work as part of their curriculum, as Dee was a thought leader in Hermetic philosophy. However, as they only had access to several of his journals, the Golden Dawn were wholly unaware of the existence of the Book of Logaeth. This resulted in a divergent Enochian system of magic that resembles, but is ultimately separate from Dee's original. And for the next 100 years, including Enochian's popularization by the famous Aleister Crowley, Dee's system was overlooked. That is, until the early 2000s, when the internet rediscovered John Dee's original work. Today, students of the occult have put in monumental effort to decipher and understand Enochian as Dee saw it, and perhaps overcome the barriers he never made it past. But certain questions may forever remain. Do you think the two Englishmen actually spoke to angels? Is Enochian really the world's most ancient language? And will the hidden ciphers of the Book of Logaeth ever be decrypted? Let your theories be known in the comments below, and maybe we can solve these mysteries. As for now, thank you all so much for watching. If you haven't already, subscribe to my channel, hit the bell icon, and as always, friends, stay tuned for the next episode of Truth or Lore. I'd like to give a massive shout out to those who pledged to my Patreon, and to my two Diamond Tier patrons, Ashes of Zayon and Capricorn Studios. Thank you guys so much for your contribution to the show.